I think it's 5:45, so we're going to get started. Hi, everybody. This is Weird Tech. We're going to be telling you some stories that we've had from working with novel hardware. This is, well, first, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. So my name is MJ. I am a game designer and programmer. I founded a studio called Astire Games here in Austin. I've worked with a lot of different hardware that I'm going to be showing you all today, but I've also, I teach at the Art Institute. I teach game design and gameplay scripting there. And yeah, that's me. So who wants to go next?
Hi, I'm Steve Lukas. I'm with Across Realities. Most recently, I was a venture capitalist for 3.5 years, investing in such great VR AR companies as Owlchemy Labs. And now I'm working on building asymmetric multi-user experiences for VR and AR.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Andrew Eiche. My official title is Developer and Producer-Extraordinaire and Alleged Certified Adult TM at Owlchemy Labs. Before that, which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about, I used to work for government consulting companies and did a lot of work on military and other government hardware, so you'll see a bunch of that.
Hi, I'm Adam Creighton. I'm the studio GM and Director of Development for Panic Button. We do a bunch of different projects for hardware that is not out yet, and did that for Switch before it released, or VR, those kind of things. And I am the weird technology.
I'm Tristan Parrish-Moore. I'm the designer and co-founder of Broken Window Studios, who has a couple of different games in development, some that are on Steam and some that are coming. I've done design for a few years, and we've had a lot of fun with VR and some random goofball technologies that we've enjoyed working with, so I'll be talking about that.
All right. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. We're going to tell you a series of stories, and these are going to be success stories and failure stories and what we learned from those experiences. And we're going to tell you about the struggles and rewards we've had when working with cutting-edge technology. And we've all worked with a lot of different things. Individually, we worked with different things, but we've also worked with different things from each other. So we've got a pretty broad spectrum of technology to tell you about. So I'm going to kick this off with a success story. So I'm going to tell you a story of when I worked with the Z-Space. Have any of you ever used the Z-Space before? A few of you? Cool. So the Z-Space, for anyone who doesn't know, is a semi-holographic tablet. It's a large tablet, and you wear special glasses that have trackers on them, so you can look around and you see a hologram coming out of the tablet, and you have a stylus to interact with the world that is being displayed. This project that I did, it was quite a few years ago, and one of the things that we were trying to explore with it is a lot of the things that were available for the Z-Space at that time, you sort of looked down into the hologram as if you were looking into a box. And we really wanted something that would come up into the world that you could interact with. And we wanted also to, we were one of the first teams to make a game for the Z-Space, and so we wanted to have a pretty big open playing space. So some of the interesting things we did was we decided to have floating islands as our play environment, and we made it so that if you slid your head side to side, it would rotate through the sequence of islands. So we opened up the play space to a very large world that you could then move through and see different parts of the world. We also, I thought, was a really interesting use of the stylus. We made it a pair of chopsticks in the digital display, so that when you click the button with the stylus, it's actually pinching the chopsticks. And a lot of people sort of felt disengaged from the stylus initially because it was just sort of a floating point in the world. But once we added the chopsticks, it grounded it in reality to an interaction that people were accustomed to. So that's my story of working with the Z-Space. And up next, Adam will have a story for you.
Thanks, MJ. So my success story is the Nintendo Switch, and a lot of these success or failure things are only that way in hindsight. We were working on the hardware for a long, long time. And anytime there's new consumer hardware coming out, people want it to be a success, right? People aren't building things because they expect it to fail. There's a whole bunch of things outside of anybody's control as to whether a piece of hardware is going to be the thing that people go after. So we were working on this hardware for quite a while, and Nintendo is very good about protecting confidentiality and keeping things close to the vest as they let out features for developers or consumers for upcoming hardware. And one of the challenges we had, and a lot of developers had, was not knowing exactly what the spec was going to be for different bits of hardware. So there was a lot of prototyping we did for, at the time, the next Nintendo hardware. That we didn't know whether it was going to be in or not. So we did gameplay mechanics based on different features. Because one of the things that's important for Nintendo is they do not want things to be gimmicky. They want them to be very tight, and I don't either as a gamer. I want features tied in that make sense for the form factor and for the delivery and target platform. So what we ended up doing, because we didn't know what things would land or what things wouldn't, even though we were working with the hardware very early, what we did is we identified a bunch of different gameplay mechanics that were fun in and of themselves. And we did that both in our own titles and then in other titles that we were identifying that were out there. And then once features became very, very clear for what was going to be available in the consumer hardware, what we did is we moved very, very quickly. We took a title, Astro Duel Deluxe, that we launched in May, and from the decision to do it to launch was 3 months, the development and everything else. And what it does is it lets you play 6-player, same screen, multiplayer, in any combination. So taking off the Joy-Cons, using them in dual mode, flipping them sideways, using them in horizontal, or any of that kind of thing. So we were able to create a very good experience for gamers that not only leverage the hardware, but really fit in with that Nintendo DNA, that sitting on the couch with a bunch of people and playing together. And then the hardware is doing phenomenally well. So that's one of those things that's outside of our control. We did a product for it that we were really happy with, and then the hardware does all the rest as far as the success goes. Thanks. Next slide. Tristan.
Hi guys. How do I play this video? There's a play button? Okay. Yes, I think. Close enough? No? I don't see a play button here, so.
Let me see.
Okay. Oh, okay, there it is. Okay, it's just on the wrong screen. Okay, so this is a clip from my game Reflections, if it plays. Doesn't look like it wants to. Oh, is there another way of viewing it? Okay. This is weird tech actually. So, okay. So this is our game.
Hey, you're up. Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I came by early, and your mom just let me in.
Now the
I
dot
figured I'd
there
just
is
wait
eye
until you
tracking.
got up.
So the character responds differently based on where you're looking. So if you look away from her,
Is this a bad time?
so she gets annoyed, and then you select which options you
I know, but
pick
this is the
by
last day we
eye
have
tracking.
to see each other. So I wanted to make sure we had some time together.
I'm just looking off.
You're busy. We can talk more later.
So this was kind of an interesting collaboration with Tobii eye tracking. So how many of you have seen Tobii eye tracking before? Okay, so a good number of you. Okay, awesome. So yeah, in our game, we had initially come up with the idea that basically when you're comparing normal human communication to video games, a lot of times it falls flat. And the example that I always give is like when you're talking to Dr. Kleiner in Half-Life 2 and he's telling you about the things that you need to do to save the world, and instead you're busy like teleporting a head crab and like breaking pots in his office. There's a lot of disconnect with players who are just actually not paying attention to what's happening in the game environment. So we had already come up with the idea that we wanted to be able to judge the amount of attention that the player was giving to these AI characters in our game. And so when we talked to Tobii, we found out that we could actually do that in an even more interesting way because Tobii's little eye tracking bar gives us the ability to figure out where a user is actually looking on the screen. So we'd previously been thinking of it in terms of frustum checks of like, is something on camera or not? But having the ability to use actual eye tracking data gave us a lot of facility to actually make that feel like a genuine interaction where the experience was added and improved, but we didn't lose anything in the process. And I think that that's a lot of what we do when we're judging the difference between maybe kind of an experimental or gimmicky piece of hardware and something that we actually think is worth investing some time in is, are we going to be giving the player a better experience that doesn't sacrifice something? And so I think that Tobii eye tracking has been a really good partner because they've helped us do the integration. It was all very smooth. It's very stable technology, and we got to see a lot of value out of it. So that was my success story there. So you got it? All right.
So typically, with all weird tech and unusual tech, the first question that comes to mind is, what do we do with it? Because you'll see eye tracking, leap motion. When I was working in some R&D labs, then the first thing that comes to mind is, how do we use this and what component does it take, and how can it play in with our current ecosystem? And so having a project is always really good to be able to say, here's a use case for the weird tech. And in 2010, Robert Downey Jr. in the movie Iron Man 2 used the most advanced, sophisticated augmented reality interface that was mind-blowing, was phenomenal. There were no wires, no headset, no controllers, and it was all fake. It was all CG. So with VR and AR tech, which is relatively new technology, we're seeing it being developed by a number of different manufacturers, and each one is finding something good that they're doing, something really unique that they're bringing to the table, but we haven't yet seen an interface that is analogous to what Robert Downey Jr. was doing. So we said, let's take a look and see if we can take what we like best about each different piece of hardware and put it together and simulate that experience today. Play. So here we have the HoloLens, which is one of the most, we have the HoloLens, so it's completely tether-free. The person in the headset is walking around and being unrestricted by wires and holding Vive controllers, because the HoloLens, we've noticed, is the best AR tracking, while the Vive controllers are the best VR tracking that we've experienced. But just about a month ago, then the new revelations with AR Core and AR Kit for iPhone and Android are allowing for these mobile devices to be a really cool mixed reality viewer. So putting these together, HoloLens also has good voice control. So you'll see that here.
Show Paris.
The image is replicated on the iPad.
Zoom out.
And using the HoloLens voice control, I'm actually able to zoom in on the map and zoom out as well, and change the location. So that's using Mapbox technology, because we wanted to be able to visualize something very similar to the Iron Man 2 story. And what we found here is, when you take a look at the different types of technologies that are available, you need to identify what is it that this really brings to the table that we can use, and how do we utilize it. And here we're taking the same digitalization model and being able to create a limitless PowerPoint where you don't have to be restricted to a 50-inch screen. And all the same principles apply in VR. You may hear a lot of VR versus AR stories, but everything in VR, such as laser pointers, can be used in this environment. And here you'll see a picture-in-picture of myself in the HoloLens on the top right. That's my point of view, while the AR Kit is filming what everyone else in the room sees. None of this is post-processing. None of this is done with CG. This is all real-time being filmed with iPhones and iPads, as you can see right here. But then, of course, when you're working on all these disparate technologies, you'll see that in some cases, things aren't necessarily designed to work together. The way that HoloLens AR tracking works, as well as the Vive base station tracking, it's very similar. They both use lasers. So what you're going to see here is some of the tracking gets lost. When the HoloLens looks directly at the controller loses tracking, and then suddenly the map falls to the ground. And that's going to happen a few times here. And so there's still ways you'll need to work around getting systems to work together, but we found success in that we were able to approximate the imagery that we were looking for while still building towards something new.
I got my own. Right, do it. I brought my own mic. Ooh, the screen is here. Let's embiggen this. All right, so I'm going to talk about some weird military shit. This is the WIN-T, which is the Warfighter Information Network Tactical, and this is the Tactical Communication Node. The actual hardware is that truck on the left. That's it. So we had a problem where we had to update we had a little box inside there. It ran a version of Windows XP embedded. So this is 2008. And it was like a touchscreen, which was super novel at the time. And we were like, okay, this is great. We put this touchscreen in. Basically, it controlled the radios and the phones. It was a VoIP and an ROIP system. And so this was awesome because now you don't have to dial each radio. You just have this magic touchscreen. It runs our software. Great. Problem being that we had to update that software. And we had to update it, and that was out in Iraq and Afghanistan on the actual battlefield. So we're like, okay, how do we go ahead and update that software? And to further complicate things, we bolted the thing into the vehicles. We can't get it back, and we can't ship a vehicle back to Columbia, Maryland, where I worked. So they assigned me this project. They said, you have a month, and all you have is one USB port, an Ethernet port, and there's another computer inside this vehicle. So best of luck, go for it. And so what we ended up doing is this was a great success. So we ended up using the computer with a bootable CD to boot either a version of Linux or basically a little server that did something called pixie booting, which is sending an image. So we pixie booted, then that booted up its own version of Linux, which ran a set of open source software called Clonezilla, had an image file in it, and dumped it on the little device, and that worked great. That's awesome because it doesn't involve shipping a thumb drive into the battlefield. We can just send an ISO file, it burns onto a CD, everybody's happy. So, all that being said, there was one funny technical thing that happened, which is every time we updated it, because of the limitations of Clonezilla at the time, we lost 20 megabytes of space. But it was a 2 gigabyte hard drive. So what's the point of all this? Like, this isn't Unity, this is some weird fighting vehicle. But what the point of this is, Unity is an incredible tool, but did I lose my mic? Hello? Oh, there I am. All too often, I see developers relying too heavily on the C# scripting backend and digging too deep into trying to reinvent the wheel. And in this case, all those tools I talked to are off-the-shelf, open source things that we use to deploy this. And all those tools are available to all you. And it doesn't matter whether it was a weird C++ application or it was a special Unity application. All this stuff works. And to kind of go further on this, even today, even as late as last week, I was still doing batch scripting to help us, deploy and to help us with our processes. So these things are tools that any of you can pick up today and any of you can run with, and they're all available to you. And that was a success story where we couldn't install anything and we just used everything that we could find.
Don't applaud between every story. You guys will applaud way too many times. We have many stories left to tell you. So now we're going to go into a series of failure stories. So we all have experienced failure at different times. And we have some particularly interesting stories of times when we failed to use hardware in a certain way, or the hardware failed us, or the situation in some way failed. So we're going to tell you what we learned from those experiences and what we did to overcome those failures. So first up is Andrew.
I'm back. All right. More. So this might be my. So virtual worlds. Let's talk about virtual worlds. So they were like a really hot thing in like 2009, and At the time, the government and the military, so I worked for all these government agencies in the military, were like, we're gonna do everything virtual worlds. We don't need offices anymore. Figure it out. This is gonna be amazing. And so you're like, okay, that's awesome. We're gonna figure this out. And they were terrible. And my favorite example is we worked with this one company, this one very large defense contractor, and they were like, put all our products in the virtual world. And we were like, are you sure? And they're like, yes, we're sure, do it. And so we're like, okay. So we set up a meeting room with and they always had to populate these rooms with random people. So it was the CTO and the CEO and then 10 interns who were like, these are our fast risers, or junior employees. The junior employees are all gamers, so immediately what happens is they're sitting in a room and we have this thing, it's like this, but we can lock you in your seat. So we lock you in your seat, and then somebody spawns a hand grenade and throws it in, and then the chat goes nuts saying oh my god, there's a hand grenade, and then we had virtual death in there because it had to be used for training too. So then half the participants die and they can't use their camera anymore. And then somebody figures out how to unwedge themselves from the seat and spawns a fighter jet and begins flying over the entire office setting, strafing and shooting as the instructor is screaming get down from there, come back down here right now. And there's M16 spawning and all these weapons are all shooting each other. So anyway, yeah, it was a complete disaster. Needless to say, that deployment didn't go so well. At one point, an executive stood up from his chair and spiked a headphone on the ground. So it was a total failure. So what's the whole point of this? Basically, there's a lot of things that happen with technology where people aspirationally are going to put every hope and dream. In virtual worlds, everybody was like, we should make an application that does everything. And that turned out terrible. In fact, a lot of what ended up coming of all of this, and each of these is actually a different virtual world on the screen, but a lot of what came out of all those studies was that we figured out that it was better to build a purpose-built application that just did the one thing people wanted to do and let that grow into something larger than it was to try to build a simulation of the entire world. And I think that goes for when you're looking at new technology, just be wary of the people who say that this technology does literally everything, but they don't have a use case where it does that one thing well. All right, next slide.
Cool. All right. So my failure story is deals with Microsoft KINECT. We were really early on with KINECT. One of the first developers with it back when it was Natal and limited kits and proof of concept and all this kind of thing, and built several titles on it. We did the flight mission modes for KINECT Star Wars and some of those things. Hulk Hogan's main event. We did a wrestling KINECT. A rodeo KINECT game, which is about as niche as you can get. So we were doing quite a bit, and what we wanted to do is wanted to make a high-quality KINECT title. So this is at the tail end of the original KINECT, and then the new KINECT had been announced. So we're moving forward with this title, and the screenshots that are up here, this is a fully playable demo that we had that worked for KINECT, where you could choose your fighter, you could box against this, and then you got your whole recap screen and a bunch of stats and some other stuff that played through. A very robust technical demo and proof of concept and identity kind of thing that we had going on. And then very early on, KINECT was unbundled from the Xbox One. So you had this guaranteed install base that was then no longer guaranteed. We had relationships on the business side and on the partner side and things like that, so we had very early visibility that this was going to become unbundled. And so we stopped this particular title that was aimed at, again, when I was saying earlier, we didn't want something gimmicky for the hardware. We wanted something that leveraged the hardware and made sense for the hardware. So this was a title that wasn't as compelling outside of the KINECT integration. So it's a failure in the sense that on the business side, we couldn't guarantee the platform would be there. But because we had the business relationship, and that's a lesson learned, that we were able to fish and cut bait instead. So that was important for us. The other lesson that's in there, and it's really applicable to VR, AR, MR, and things like that, there's a lot of the challenges, and I did VR stuff in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then we did a lot of this KINECT development, and you have some of the same problems where you turn around and you lose arms and appendages, and and things like that. I'll hear people talk about challenges that, oh, this has never been experienced before, and it's exactly what we dealt with KINECT as far as the fidelity and turning around and all this other stuff. There's a lot of lessons learned to be learned from previous tech, and it's super important because I like the idea of innovating on top of innovation, because then I get to springboard, as opposed to spending 6 or 8 months or several years trying to do something that's already been figured out last time we did VR. So I think there's some important lessons to be learned there, and then it's also the business side of things. It's not just about the tech or the design or the innovation. Those partnerships are super important because they inform what's going to be there or what's not going to be there.
All right, so I have an interesting failure story. It's a bit shorter, so I'll try to keep us on time here. So I worked for Virtuix, the makers of the Omni, which is a 360-degree treadmill. And at the time when I started working there, they mostly just had shooters, and they had a plastic Xbox gun that they used with it. And so one of the things that I learned, that was my first time working at a company that was developing hardware, and one of the things that I learned there was that when you're working on hardware that's not done, there are always risks that it will just stop working, and it might stop working at a very inappropriate time for it to stop working. And I had made this demo that was a virtual tour of Amsterdam, and I was trying to, since the company had only made shooters, I was trying to do something that was a little bit more approachable. It didn't have any violence in it. You just walk around Amsterdam. And so the problem with this was that you weren't holding the Xbox gun, and I hadn't realized at the time that when problems happen with the hardware, whoever was demoing would use the joystick on the gun to resync the game so that it didn't look like it had stopped working. And that was an important lesson for me to learn that sometimes you have to be able to fake things when you're showing new hardware because it doesn't work as continuously as you would like it to work. But I did actually, we found a way to fix this. What we did was we added the ability to take pictures while you're walking around Amsterdam, so it gave you a reason to hold a controller. And so this gave the player something to put in their hand so that they actually could walk around and take pictures, and then actually view those pictures afterwards as well, which was really cool for a lot of people. And this fixed the problem that when we were demoing in important places, we had the joystick there available in case we needed to fix things on the fly. So that was my lesson learned there. All right, Tristan.
Okay, so this may be something that is a little bit contentious, but I wanted to say it anyway because I think it was a lesson that I needed to learn. Who here worked with the original DK1 for the Oculus? Okay, who did that and then also got the DK2? Who did that and then also got the CV1? Who did that and then switched to Vive? Who did that and then also got an OSVR? Okay, all right, I finally found the thing that nobody did. Okay, when I was initially thinking about VR, I was looking at it as a monitor replacement, is the way that I kind of approached it. And so I thought that I was going to be this super genius that did this thing that nobody ever thought of, and I was going to write basically conditional statements for if we were running VR, we would change some aspect of our gameplay, and then if we weren't running VR, then it would just run the standard setup. And so initially, I thought that was going to be very easy because I was thinking, okay, we change the way that the arm moves when you're in VR, or we change the way that the camera orients your character. But then we would start noticing, oh, well, also the menu system doesn't really work anymore, so I'd add another if statement into the menu system so that it would be doing the thing with VR in the menu, and then I would say, oh, actually, half the post processes need to be turned off, so I'm going to put another set of if statements for all of the things that don't want to be running the post effects when you're in VR. And then they had an API update, and then none of my code worked anymore because I had to actually go through and update all of the integration of the VR pipeline for the previous version to now work with the new version. So I don't know if you know this, but Unity actually has this thing called prefabs. And the way that prefabs are supposed to work is that you make a prefabricated set of content that actually is set up for specifically the kind of thing that you're trying to do. And so what I had accidentally done is I had made it that if I wasn't constantly getting version updates for all of this hardware, that the core game, even without VR, would stop working. And so I would have to go through and make sure that all of these kind of conditional statements just kept being maintained and maintained and maintained. And it was something like I would go from toggling one script on and off to like having to write dozens of lines of code to process this slight change. And so what we did moving forward is we started saying that we're going to set up prefabs for each kind of major change in how the platform is going to be configured. We still have some options for how the user would tune it, but it was a much smarter idea for us to say, this is the VR prefab of the player, this is the non-VR prefab of the player. Every time we're doing those things, we're just swapping out which version we're trying to work with. And I thought that initially it was going to save us all this time to have everything embedded, but the reality is the amount of things that actually overlap is much less than you think initially when you set out to make something compatible with these different kind of hardware devices. So we ultimately just realized that we didn't want to create hundreds of wasted hours by trying to be super clever and making all these conditional statements. And I would definitely strongly advocate that for anybody who's working with interesting tech in the future, is if it's an optional control configuration, make sure that you're keeping those somewhat separated so that your main game never becomes dependent on functionality that's subject to change while you're experimenting with new APIs. So, so that's my my major regret, but okay, so Steve.
So I'm not talking about the Oculus Rift controllers, but years before they had finalized hand tracking controllers, there was before Vive controllers, before Oculus Touch, before all those new systems, then VR was it was still in its early days, and we needed to figure out what's the best input system for VR. And we experienced this magnetic tracking technology with these hand controllers where you could hold the controller outside of your view and it would be able to function. And we could point at, if you had a weapon and you were shooting at a zombie, for example, then you could shoot in that direction without having to look there. And we said, that is something that we can't replicate right now with like a regular VR, a regular non-VR game. So we said, this is interesting, this is great. And with this type of tech, anything new, then there are debugging issues that you may not be aware of. So how many of you have worked on ARKit or ARCore this summer? Right. So I'm sure you've gotten into a situation where you hit a bug and you're thinking, is this because it's my device, or is it the Apple beta, or is it the Xcode beta, or is it the Unity beta, or is it something else entirely? And it's hard to pinpoint. In some cases, it was Apple didn't flip a switch on their back-end server, even though everything else was up to date. So same thing with all new, untested technology. And here, we had purchased one of these tracking systems, and we'd seen the demo, and it was great. You were able to move around about 9 feet from the base station. It was fantastic. You could move around in a lot of just freedom movement. And I took it home, and it looked great. And I brought it back to the office, and suddenly my tracking was only about 5, 6 feet. And I thought, what did I do wrong? Is it something when I unplugged it and plugged it back in? And so I had to check the laptop because it was a PC which may not have the right version of Windows or might not have the right drivers. And we're going back and forth on it. And I had to finally take the laptop and the system and start walking around my office complex, going from garage to garage and plugging in the power into whatever outlet I could find to see, is it something else that's going on? And I brought around a measuring tape, and I was concerned because this is a company big enough where people look at you and say, I need to see your badge because I don't know if you work here. And here I was looking like a hacker from a 90s movie, going into the garage and being on the floor, opening a laptop and trying to use some crazy system that no one had seen. And finally, I found that one specific garage had so much interference that it was down to less than 2.5 feet of range. And that's when I closed the laptop and shouted, it's not me, it's something else. So the big takeaway is sometimes everything else can be a perfect world, everything else is working, but you still have to identify that it could be something in your environment. In this case, magnetic interference from girders in a garage. So watch out for that. With weird tech, it may be something that you've never expected, and it may not be you.
All right, so the next set of stories we have is of the weirdest hardware that we've ever used. So we're each going to tell you about the strangest things that we've done with hardware or the strangest hardware that we've used. And Adam is going to kick this off for us.
Now, all right. So I was thinking through a lot of things, and a lot of tech that I've worked with in the past or things like that. I was trying to get permission to talk about some weird tech, and people are like, we don't want to talk about that ever. But one of them that came to mind was the LARRABEE architecture from Intel. So this is a time where game engines are being solicited to do everything from visual simulation to the next generation of games to real-time movies to everything else. You've got this kind of arms race that's going on with the cell processor, and LARRABEE has its multi-core device where it's going to do cache coherency across all cores and all this stuff. And then you had NVIDIA and AMD before acquisitions, and it was just kind of an insane time. And people were trying to figure out, okay, how do we get more from these processors? How do we do more with the knowledge that we have in building these combo CPU, GPU things? And this was one of those things, and no disrespect to anybody if you were at Intel and worked on LARRABEE, but this was one of those things that came in, it was super secret, people were individually NDA'd, there's all this time as we're trying to figure out, okay, what can we do with this thing? We had this locked in a room where people were key badged access to be able to work on this, and I was working for a game engine company at the time. And it was a mini refrigerator when we initially got it, and it was heating up the room, so much so that in North Carolina winters, people would get their coffee and lean against the LARRABEE vault because it was warm, felt good. And I would have these conversations with people that were very high up in this project, and I would talk about, look, I'm doing math on the physics side of things, and I know there's only a certain amount of coolness you can get to this thing. I know that you can't get below, it was roughly 780 watts for powering this thing, which is untenable for consumers. And I would get into these round-robin discussions where someone would say, yeah, that's fine, it's not a problem on the commercial sector. I said, yeah, but you're aiming this at consumers. And they said, yeah, but it's fine, this is no problem on the commercial sector. And I would say, we're aiming this at consumers. And they would say, no, it's fine, it's not a problem on the commercial. And are we in a different world? Is this something where, does commercial now mean consumer? Is there something I don't know? But it was one of those things where it was supposed to be the next big thing in this arms race for scalable processing. And not just Intel as they're going after this, all these different players were trying to figure out how to be the next massively distributed processing solution. And nobody on any front wanted to say, man, we could be wrong. Because this wasn't all eggs in one basket kind of thing. And I would get diagrams like this or some others that were even funnier. But and I would have these conversations, and it was a math physics thing where you knew what things could and couldn't be done. And that's far down the road, right? When these projects start, people don't start these things to fail, right? This is another one of those hindsight things. But what it was for me is it, as new technology comes out, I spend a lot of time just asking some very, very fundamental questions. Everything from audience, and I do a lot of math, I do a lot of computational modeling, I do a lot of stuff to figure out, okay, what has to happen for this thing to be successful? And this is the thing that honestly taught me that, because this is one of those things on paper with who was involved and everything else. Should have been amazing. I was talking to some people on the competitive side earlier today, and they said, yeah, this thing had us sweating bullets. We were really scared of this thing. And then we were totally not scared at all. So this is one of those weird ones where it was the big dog, it was the 800-pound gorilla that was going to take over the everything. We were all in, and then it just kind of flamed out horribly.
All right, so many years ago, I attended a program at Carnegie Mellon called the Entertainment Technology Center. Anybody heard of it? So there are a few of the alumni here, I think. I've seen a few of them. So it's a very interesting program where we explore a lot of different things. We explore different technology and different ways of interacting with technology. And one of the projects I was on there was an experimental exercise game. And we kind of decided to just push the bounds as far as we could. We decided to see, we had picked up different kinds of hardware that could be used for exercise games, and we liked all of them, and we just decided to use all of them. So we have, in this game, we have a Wii Fit balance board. Each of the players is standing on a Wii Fit balance board, and there's a KINECT that is tracking just the upper body, so the arms and the torso. And then each player is wearing a polar heart rate monitor. And so we have this exercise game where the players are on a balance board steering a hovercraft in the world. So you lean to steer your hoverboard. And it's a cooperative game, so it's for 2 players. So 2 balance boards, 1 KINECT, 2 polar heart rate monitors, and an Arduino on each side is capturing the data from the polar heart rate monitors and pulling that into the computer. And the game is actually responding to the player's heart rate. So as we take a baseline right at the beginning, and as your heart rate increases, you become more powerful in the game. So by actually engaging in the exercise mechanics, you get stronger in the game and stronger in real life, you know, from exercising. So this was a really bizarre thing that we did where we combined all these pieces of hardware together. And it's totally not something that could ever be shipped and distributed to people. But what we found was that this is the perfect kind of experience to have set up at an arcade or at events or at carnivals or things like that, where there's a lot of people milling around who can take turns using it. So we ended up making it as sort of an installation piece that could be set up at different places. And it was a ton of fun to work with, but it was also really bizarre because we had so many different things that all had to work, and if one of them didn't work, then nothing worked. And so sometimes we didn't know which thing was causing the whole thing to stop working. So this was a really bizarre and exciting project. And up next is Andrew.
So I talked about a bunch of weird tech, but I wanted to talk about a weird DevRel problem I had. So we're gonna try to like wipe all the names so that way no one's incriminated in this. But back some years ago, we were reached out to by a new hardware partner, and they said, hey, we want you to come test this headset, and we want you to make stuff for it. We love what you do. And I was working for a giant government contractor, so like we want you. And so we're like, okay, what do we got to do to get this done? And they're like, well, we're not going to give it to you unless you come out for a 3-day exploratory jam with which you sit with our engineers and we teach you all the intricacies of this headset. And this is like unreleased to the public, NDA'd stuff. So we're like, okay, cool. Yeah, we'll do that. So we fly out. Myself and my business partner at the time. We fly out and we're like, we get to the hotel and we're like, man, the address for the summit thing looks like it's super far away. And so we had to come up with like a code word where it's like, if we think they were going to a murder cabin, we gotta have a word. I think it was like bananas, where it's like, we're gonna leave right now. Like, hey, do you have any bananas? And so we drive out to this place, and we were driving up winding roads over and over and over, and like we drive like 15 miles into like woods to the top of this hill, and it's a house. And when we get there, we're greeted by a guy wearing like no shoes that's just like, hey, what's up? Welcome to our dev cabin house place. And we're like, oh, holy shit, we're actually in their studio. Okay, well, that's cool. We can roll with this. And then throughout the experience, they kept coming back to us like after they had like showered, and it was like clear that we were like kind of in their living space. And it was super weird because like they invited us, and we're part of this large consulting firm. We're like, we're here. This is going to be very professional. We're ready to go. And it was like super different than what we expected, as these people are like coming out of showers and like their tech is like taped together. And then we like started to make, so we're doing this game jam and they're like interviewing us at the same time, and all this stuff is taped together, and we're just trying to piece something together, and we're like, okay, we're making a game, and they're like, we didn't invite you to make a game. Can you please go get some government data and do government things? And we're like, all right. So long story short, we end up piecing together some visualization of US Census data and put all this together. But every night on our way out, and it was a 3-day thing, they would be like, "Be careful going back to your rental car. There's cougars out there." And we were like, "All right." So what does any of this mean, right? What does this mean for DevRel or for anything? Well, this is my pitch to you if you are doing middleware or hardware or anything like that, which is don't do a jam in your house. Like, it should have just been in that hotel. Like, you just go rent a room, and yeah, like, I get that you want us to integrate with your like super cool studio sitch, but like, I really don't want like your engineers dripping wet hair like hanging out over my computer. So yeah, that was super weird. Would not do again.
All right, so this is a video I stole from online, which is just a running hamster ball. So I'm not going to play it, but imagine people getting run over by a giant hamster ball. It's kind of a metaphor for this experience. Basically, we went to an unnamed event and saw an unnamed developer, so it's a similar type of situation, where they were doing VR where you could walk in the VR space because you were literally in a giant hamster ball sized for humans. So it was quite an interesting experience because it didn't work. And then once the hamster ball started moving, you had to like try to stop it because it would continue to roll past the threshold of the movement that you thought you were making. And so then they gave us their API so that we could work with this, so that we could integrate it into our game. And what we saw was that all that it was doing was that the hamster ball was like triggering WASD commands. And so like, the hamster ball was somehow telling it which one of those 4 directions it was supposed to go. And I was like, wow, this looks the same as the default Unity code for like making a character move. But thanks for the example. So then we talked with them a little bit about like what they saw as a plan for collaboration, because we were already getting a little bit suspicious, and they were like, well, this will give you great exposure. And I was like, okay, do you have any money or financial arrangement or like anything that we would get out of this? And they were like, well, we've got 5 Facebook followers, but we're working on a 6th. And so I realized that like the problem with some hardware relationships, fortunately I didn't have to say bananas in our situation, but the people who are trying new, interesting hardware sometimes aren't quite all the way there towards the new or the interesting or the hardware part. And so they will often try to get you to spend a lot of time and energy doing something that would have absolutely no value to you ever, and then tell you that it will probably pay off for you in the future. And so we decided that hamster ball VR was not really for us, and we moved in the direction of finding more reliable partners. So just something to think about when you go into your next partnership.
All right, we're on to the last set of stories, and we are getting a bit short on time, so we're actually going to do these stories a little bit faster. But I wanted to close with something inspirational, so we're all going to talk about something that either we're working on now or that we worked on previously that were either inspired by the work itself or inspired by the hardware and what the hardware has to offer. And Adam is first.
All right, so my dad is a lifetime medical doctor. My older brother is a doctor that's literally working to cure cancer. My mom's a certified and registered nurse, and I make video games. So, and I say that tongue in cheek because I believe what we do is amazingly important. It elevates people's narrative needs, their souls, and it's a very, very important thing. But I make this joke all the time that, hey, I got all this medical family and I make games, and, Thanksgiving is really awkward. I made this joke one too many times with a friend, and he grabbed me and drove me to his children's cancer ward where they're playing Disney Epic Mickey on the Wii, which is a game I was a producer on. And it was a really good reminder of how important what we do is, and that those things have life beyond what we're trying to do for people who are trying to tick the Metacritic checkbox or get a certain number of sales or anything else. And then you have these things where people are using these tools for very real-world therapy situations, and not in a, hey, we want to experiment a little bit. But we found these things to work. The image on the left is for a physical therapy for, and it's from Getty Images, for people who, elderly folks who end up getting serious physical injuries. The one on the right is for wounded soldiers and getting motor skills back and things like that. The other thing that people don't always know is, whoops, maybe we went too far. All right. So Nintendo wants to now say, hey, we're going to do this sleep monitor thing, and people are like, what? This is crazy. They're making a sleep monitor thing, and they had this slide that talked about, you know, where they fit into the health thing. What people don't realize is Nintendo is hardcore involved in physical therapy and restoration and the medical community, to the point that I saw a controller that was built. It's a chair. It's for quadriplegics. That has the control for breath and chin and things like that for a Super Nintendo that Nintendo built so that people could play. They were way ahead of anybody else for people with disabilities being able to play games. And they have a whole thing that they do that they never talk about and would probably be upset that I'm talking about. They have a massive effort that's a formal commercial effort where it's not for making money, it's for making lives better. And I think that's something to forget as we look at these companies as commercial consumer entities. There's a lot of good that's being done by companies like this that's even more than just, hey, we're giving money for this good thing. They're actively innovating for tools that help people with physical therapy and restoration. Very inspiring to me.
So, Arlington National Cemetery is the pride and joy, as much as you can say that, of the military cemetery system in the United States. And very early on in my career, they went to, during the time they did a review of Arlington National Cemetery, and they said, all right, let's see if we can figure out kind of who is buried where. And they found out very quickly that they didn't know. And many times they would exhume remains, and they would actually find out that it was something different than what they had. And their old system was a card catalog in a basement. So if you had a relative who served the country and either died or had served long enough that they were part of a select group of individuals who could be buried at the cemetery, then you would have to go there, go down to a card catalog, pull a card, photocopy it, and hope you can figure out the grid system with which they lay out the headstones. So this was congressional level scrutiny that happened, and it kicked in. It was all sorts of stuff. And the company I worked for at the time, Booz Allen, actually stepped in and said, you know what, we can fix this. The iPhone 2.1 had just released, and we can now make apps. And we know some people, I worked for a group called Analytics, who can make an app to fix this. So we bought, back when iPhones were brand new, we bought 200 iPhones. We bought 200 Mofis before anybody knew what the battery, like external batteries were. And we hooked them up, and every night for 2 months, something like 50 different, basically privates, went out and took photos. And so we built the app. One of the challenges was we couldn't get any data into the database because it needed to be secure, so we actually used emails. And we ended up just like whatever we could do to tape it together. The whole development cycle of this process was, the first one was released in 2 weeks, and then we would just do 2-week iterations, sending it out, figuring out how to load 200 iPhones in a time when app development was novel. And we did this, and this turned out to be something incredibly powerful. And while we didn't make all the money in the world, and yeah, we used it to show off our capability, we didn't do it to do that. We did it because we felt a responsibility, especially considering that one of our biggest customers was military. We felt a responsibility as citizens to jump in and do this service. And today, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery, the data we collected can be used for the ANC Explorer app, which has a bunch of really great features, including if you have a relative buried there, you can go locate them and it will GPS you right over there. So it was really powerful, and it was a really interesting project, and I had to visit Arlington many times, and work with them while active funerals were happening, and that was really, it puts a lot of emotional weight on the importance of the work you're doing. And I think that sometimes we need to remember when we're doing all this work that it's not just in a bubble, that we're affecting real people and real lives.
So my story's a little more self-absorbed than Andrew's, but I had a pretty low point in my development last year because I don't know if you've encountered this, but indie development can be hard sometimes. We've gone through a number of struggles to make sure that we can release the games that we want to on our schedule, but also still, eat food. At the middle of 2016, I felt like it seemed like there was no light at the end of the tunnel. And we ended up going to E3 and meeting with people who are part of the Steel Media Network. And they wanted us to participate in this global VR challenge. And they told us that you could work with this exciting new Chinese headset that nobody had heard of at the time. So we had this thing sent to us in it literally looked like somebody just wrapped it with saran wrap and jammed it into a small box and then shipped it 7,000 miles to us. We opened it up. It didn't even work properly at first. We had to get help to do it. And then I had to pay for a visa to be able to go to China. And there's part of me that was thinking that maybe I was going to China to never return and become some kind of slave laborer or something. But I actually didn't have the money to pay for the visa. So I asked if they could maybe try to cover me or something like that. And they actually said yes, which I was amazed by. So I went to this 10-day trip in China, and our game ended up being pitted against 200 Western developers and a similar number of Chinese developers. It came down to 10 Western developers and I think about 5 Chinese developers. And we actually won the competition in the grand prize. And so I literally went from not being able to afford a $300 visa charge to having $17,000 in both a fake and a real check. Though I tried cashing that one and it actually didn't work very well. So what I thought was interesting about this was just a couple of things. When you look at the IGF, IGF has I think over 1,000 games submitted now, but we were competing against a couple hundred games because we were in a category of weird tech. And a lot of times groups will actually provide incentives like this to people who are working with weird tech because they want to see somebody actually make a success out of it. And so if we hadn't been in that ballpark of being willing to stretch ourselves in that direction and do something that was super goofy and strange, we never would have gotten this kind of prize. And so I think it's important to always look for opportunities where you can find something that might be a novel or unusual idea that could actually pay dividends for you as a developer. But yeah, so also I wish that I had something to say about soldiers, but
Okay, so Matterport, is anyone familiar with Matterport, this camera? Great. What Matterport is, for the rest of you, is it's a way of being able to take essentially 360 scan of a property, like your house, and be able to reconstruct it into this beautiful Google Street View type of viewer that you can see online. One of the other things they allow you to do is be able to get a 3D model of it. So we thought, this is great. Let's take a 3D model of a property and be able to navigate through it in VR. Unfortunately, if you look at the top right image, you'll see that some of the triangles break up a little bit. It's a good approximation for a single 360 imagery at a time, but for the areas that you've scanned, but the overall 3D model isn't as crisp. So looking at it another way, instead of doing a VR walkthrough, what if we use this to remodel a property? So we threw it into a game engine and then actually remodeled the house and put down different floorings and different paint until we found a scheme we liked. And we did this actually to remodel a house that we were buying and moving into. And this was going to be one of the toughest days of my life because any type of change is difficult, and it was time to say, hey, children, the house you've known for your entire life, we're going to move to another one. And we walked through the house, and I forgot what had happened months earlier, which was up on the right photo. But as I say, yeah, we're moving to a new house, and they walk through, then they start looking around, like, kind of funny. And then my older son says, wait a minute, this is the house from the video game. And he starts running around, he says, and our beds are gonna go over there, and then you're gonna be over here, and this is over here. And they were just super excited and running around, and I just looked at their mom and I said, look at that, like, that was easy. That was a great day. So that was, to us, the power of the game engine. And that, I'll always remember what that did for us as a family, and just how special it was that we live in this time and this age where we can create simulations of living spaces that children will see and then be able to inhabit. So that's my story.
All right, so I just want to say thank you all for coming out to our talk, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for sharing their stories. We ran a little bit over time, so I don't think we can really take questions unless they let us stay in here, but you can all come up and chat with us afterwards if you want. So thank you all for coming.